Good morning, grade 11 learners, educators and viewers. I'm Noi Munso. I'm here to do biodiversity and reproduction in plants. Let us get started. The kingdom Plantae. Plants belong to the kingdom Plantae. So there are general characteristics that all plants share in common. They are eukaryotic, which means they have a true nucleus. They are multicellular, which means they have many cells. They are autotrophs, which means they are able to make their own food during the process called photosynthesis. They all have a cell wall, which is made up of cellulose. Even though plants share certain general characteristics in common, they don't look the same. Hence, they are divided into four main groups, namely the bryophytes, the pteridophytes, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. I'll start first with the bryophytes. The word bryo means moss, phyton, a plant. Examples of the bryophytes are the mosses, the liverworts, the hornworts. Here I have an example of a moss plant, a liverwort, and a hornwort. Coming to the characteristics of the bryophytes. They are found in a water environment. They don't have vascular and strengthening tissues for support as well as for conducting water and mineral salts. So they are supported by the water in which they are found in. So in plants, there are alternation of generations. We have the Gametophyte generation that alternates with the Sporophyte generation. So in the bryophytes, the main generation or the main phase is the Gametophyte. So this is the Gametophyte phase or the Gametophyte generation. It produces gametes for sexual reproduction. So now when we look at this moss plant, it has the roots-like structures called the rhizoids, a stem-like structure, and the leaves-like structures. Here we get, this part is called the male leaf-like structure, and then here at the top it has the male sex organs, which are called the antheridia. They produce the sperms. And then here we have a female leaf-like structure. Here at the top, it produces the archegonia, which produce the eggs. So in order for sperms to move from the antheridia to the archegonia, where fertilization is going to take place, water is needed. Once fertilization has taken place, a zygote will develop into this structure, which is called the sporophyte. So the sporophyte generation is made up of a stalk, which is called a seta, and a capsule, whereby inside we get the spores. So the sporophyte generation produces the spores, as you can see here, for asexual reproduction. So in bryophytes, the leaves-like, the stem-like, and the roots-like They are referred to as a thallus plant. Coming to the pteridophytes. The word pteri means a fern. Phyton means a plant. Examples of the pteridophytes are the horsetail, the whisk fern, and the tree fern. So this fern is the one that we use at our houses as ornaments. So coming to the structure of a fern has the type of roots called the adventitious roots, an underground stem which is called a rhizome, a leaf blade which is divided into leaflets which is called the frond. On the underside of the leaves, we get the spores for sexual reproduction. Coming to the characteristics of the bryophytes, they grow in moist and shady environment. The leaves are called the sporophyls because they produce the spores on the underside. The vascular and strengthening tissues are present. Pteridophytes have true roots, stems, and leaves. It has the gametophyte, which is called a prothallus. It produces gametes for sexual reproduction. So this structure, which is called a prothallus, it has the antheridia, which produce the sperms. It has the archegonia, which produce the eggs for fertilization. So once fertilization has taken place, a zygote will be formed, and then this zygote will develop into a young sporophyte on this gametophyte generation, which is going to disappear. So later on, the young sporophyte will be an old sporophyte generation, or a sporophyte plant, which is made up of the roots like the rhizoids, a stem which is called a rhizome, and the leaves. So here, the dominant generation is called the sporophyte. The generation which is not dominant, it is called the gametophyte. So bryophytes needs water for fertilization to take place. For the sperms to move from the antheridia to the archegonia here, water is needed. Coming to the gymnosperms. The word gymno means naked. Sperma means seed. Examples are the conifers, or the pine tree, the gingos, and the cycads, to name just a few. Here we have a structure of a pine tree showing the leaves, which look like needles, the cones. So a pine tree has male cones, which are found in clusters. It has scales which looks like wings, but the scale-like wings here are closely packed. So male cones are sometimes referred to as the pollen cones. Here we have a structure of a female cone. So now when you look at this structure, we do find that the scale-like wings in a female cone are not closely packed. They are loose to create a space for the spores. So a wing-like structure of a pine, at its base there, it has an oval. It is inside this oval where we get the female gametophyte. And then here again, it is inside the male cones where we get the pollen. So the pollen will develop a pollen grain and becomes the male gametophyte. So in gymnosperms, the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte are very small. They are enclosed by the sporophyte generation. The sporophyte generation is the whole pine tree, which is made up of the roots, the stem, and the leaves. So here, it's a structure of a female cone. It shows the seeds. The seeds are not hidden in an ovary or any protective covering. They are just exposed. So here it's a pine tree, and this it's a pollen grain that develops a pollen tube with the male sex organ, and the whole of this structure is called the male gametophyte. And then here it's a female cone. This is the oval, which is found at the base of that winged scale leaf. So inside an oval, we get the female, we get the embryonic sac. So now this embryonic sac is the one which is called the female gametophyte. And here we get the pollen grains. So the pollen grains, as I said, they develop a pollen tube and then they become the male gametophyte. So in the gymnosperms, the male and the female gametophytes are separate. So for fertilization to take place in gymnosperms, wind and other agents of pollination must be present. So now these are the characteristics of the gymnosperms that I have just talked about. Coming to the angiosperms, the word angio means a sac, sperma means a seed. In angiosperms, seeds are enclosed in a sac-like structure called an ovary. So there are two classes of angiosperms. We have the monocots and the dicots. Examples of monocots are rice, wheat, maize, and sugarcane. Examples of dicots are sunflower, rose, bean, and apple tree. Here I have an example of a flowering plant showing a flower, whereby inside here we have the male part and the female part. The male part of a flower, which is called a stamen, it has an anther that produces a pollen. The pollen becomes the pollen grain, and it is referred to as the male gametophyte. And then when it comes to the pistil, which is the female part of a flower, it has the stigma, the style, the ovary. Inside the ovary, we do get the ovules. So an ovule becomes the female gametophyte. In angiosperms, just like in gymnosperms, the male and female gametophytes, they are separate, and apart from being separate, they are very small, and they are protected by the whole sporophyte plant. This plant, as you can see it, it's a sporophyte. It has the roots, it has the stem, it has the leaves. And then last but not least, we have the flowers. Here, in the oval, we need to know that it develops into a seed, and then the whole ovary will develop into a fruit. So here I have now a flower that shows all the details, an anther that produces the pollen, which I said this pollen or the pollen grains are the male gametophyte. And then here we have the female part of a flower. Here I have an ovary. Inside the ovary we get the ovules. And then the ovule or the ovules, they are the female gametophyte. The ovule, once fertilization has taken place, an ovule or the structure within an embryo called the embryonic sac will become a zygote, and later it develops into a seed. As you can see here is the seed, and the whole ovary develops into a fruit. So in angiosperms, the seeds are not naked. They are hidden by an ovary. And then once a fruit has developed here, the whole of the structure is going to disappear. So these are the characteristics of the angiosperms. As I've just said, divided into monocots and dicots. Plants are terrestrial. They have conducting and strengthening tissues. Seeds are enclosed in a spore in a fruit. The sporophyte generation is dominant. It has separate gametophytes. The pollen grain becomes the male gametophyte. The tissue in an ovule called the embryonic sac is the female gametophyte. Water again is needed. In angiosperms, water is not needed for fertilization to take place. In order for fertilization to take place here, agents of pollination are needed, such as wind, birds, and insects. So here it's a table that shows the division of plants into 4 groups according to certain features that they have and those that they don't have. Features such as true roots, stems, and leaves, vascular tissues, spores or seeds, dominant generation, dependency on water for fertilization. This is just a summary of what I have just said. So now when we go to the bryophytes, they don't have true roots, stems, and leaves. Pteridophytes, they have true roots, stems, and leaves. Gymnosperms, they have true roots, stems, and leaves. Angiosperms, true roots, stems, and leaves. Coming to the vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. Bryophytes, no xylem, no phloem. Pteridophytes, vascular tissue is present, xylem and phloem. Gymnosperm, vascular tissue is present. Vascular tissue in angiosperms is present. Bryophytes, they produce the spores, no seeds. Pteridophytes, they produce spores, no seeds. Gymnosperms, they produce cone with seeds. Angiosperms, they produce a flower with seeds. And seeds are hidden in a fruit. Coming to the generations, the bryophytes, they have the gametophyte generation, and it is dominant. Pteridophytes, they have the sporophyte generation, it is the dominant generation. Gymnosperms, the sporophyte generation is dominant. Angiosperms, the dominant generation, again, is the sporophyte. Coming to dependency on water for fertilization, bryophytes, they depend on water. Pteridophytes depend on water. Gymnosperms, they don't depend on water. They depend on agents of pollination such as wind, to mention just one example. Angiosperms, they don't need water for fertilization. They also depend on agents of pollination such as wind, birds, and insects, to mention just a few. Coming to reproduction in plants. What is reproduction? Reproduction is a process during which a new individual or individuals are produced from an already existing parent plant. Types of reproduction. We have asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. I'll start first with asexual reproduction. This is a type of reproduction that occurs in the absence of gametes. Examples are binary fission, vegetative reproduction, budding, and cloning, to mention just a few. So here I have an example of binary fission, where the body of a parent organism divides into two to form two daughter cells or two parent plants, which look exactly the same as the parents. These are the daughter plants. They look exactly the same as the parents. Another example of asexual reproduction is cloning. In cloning, the offspring is an identical of a parent, meaning that the offspring looks exactly the same as the parent who produced it. So here I have an example of a sheep. So in plants, an example of cloning could be that one of a small potato tuber that has an eye. When you put it in the soil, it germinates and produces small potatoes which look exactly the same as the parent. So another example of asexual reproduction is vegetative reproduction. Vegetative reproduction is the type of reproduction which occurs by a stem of a plant or roots of a plant or a leaf of a plant. Here it has occurred by a leaf of a plant. Here a blade is used to cut what now? A leaf. So now this leaf has developed into a new leaf plant, which looks exactly the same as the parent one. So coming to the advantages of asexual reproduction, only one parent is required. Sperms and eggs are not involved. Many offspring are produced in a short time. An example is that one of a potato that you put in the soil. It produces many potato tubers which look exactly the same as the parent tuber potato. And then another advantage is that any desirable trait is not lost. For instance, if you want to grow big potato tubers, when you put one big potato tuber in the soil, it will produce the big potato tuber offspring, meaning that the desirable trait there is not lost. There is no need to rely on pollination for new plants to form. One individual can establish a new population. One potato tuber can produce many potato tubers which become a population. Offspring and parents are the same in order for them to adapt to the environment. Disadvantages of asexual reproduction. Since there is no variation, the offspring shows the same weak characteristics, meaning that if the parent is diseased, it means the offspring again will suffer from the disease of the parent. Offspring are genetically identical to parents, meaning that if the parent is diseased, the offspring again will be diseased. They need a stable environment only. If the parents grow in an environment where there is water, the offspring again, they must be found in an environment where there is water also. Asexual reproduction may lead to overcrowding as many offspring are produced. So now this can lead to competition for space, water, and sunlight. Weakness in parents will be transferred to all the offspring. The second type of reproduction, sexual reproduction, it is the production that occurs in the presence of gametes, sperms, and the eggs. So it takes place in all the gametophytes of the groups that I have shared with you. In the gametophyte of the moss plant, sexual reproduction is taking place. In the gametophyte of a fern, sexual reproduction is taking place. In the gymnosperm, sexual reproduction is taking place. In angiosperm again, sexual reproduction is taking place. So advantages of sexual reproduction. The offspring are genetically different from the parents due to the exchange of the genes. Variation increases the chance of survival if the environment changes. Any disease that the parent may have are not passed on to the offspring, meaning that if a parent suffers from a certain disease, the offspring are not going to get the disease. Different genes lead to new individuals. Disadvantages: two parents are needed, a male and a female. Desirable traits are not necessarily passed on from parents to offspring due to a mixture of the genes from the two parents. Offspring take time to mature as it has to undergo certain stages of development, such as becoming a zygote, an embryo, and so on. Plants need agents of pollination such as wind and insects for pollen to be dispersed. The process takes longer as gametes formation takes time. Coming to the flower as a reproductive structure. This flower here is made up of the male part, which is made up of an anther and a filament. The male part is called a stamen. If you don't want to call it a stamen, you can call it androecium. So in order for you not to forget the stamen, think of what now of a male. A male is referred to, if there are many, they are male. Or think of the name of a boy called Andrew, if we want to call it the Andrewsium. So it has this anther and a filament. In the anther we get pollen. The filament supports the anther. And then here we have what now? The female part of a flower, which is called a pistil. It is made up of the sticky stigma where the pollen lands, the style to support the stigma, the ovary to house the ovules. And then from there it has this green part which is called the calyx, which is made up of the sepals. As you can see, the sepals are green in color for photosynthesis, for food to be made. And then this colored part, which is purple, is called the corolla. It is made up of the petals to attract the agents of pollination. This I've just covered. So coming to pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from an anther to a stigma of a flower. So for pollination to be transferred from an anther to a stigma, agents of pollination are needed. So we'll talk about them later on. So there are two types of pollination. We have self-pollination and cross-pollination. What is self-pollination? Self-pollination is when a pollen is transferred from an anther to a stigma of the same flower. And then cross-pollination is when pollen is transferred from an anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. So as I said, agents of pollination are needed to transfer pollen. So now let us see how a flower is adapted to be pollinated by different pollinating agents. So now here we'll start with a flower which is adapted to be pollinated by wind. It must have the following features. Pollen grains are very small and light, so they occur in very large numbers. The anthers are exposed to the wind so that pollen can easily be blown away. The stigma are feathery and sticky to catch the pollen. There is no scent. Coming to an insect-pollinated flower. So now when you look here, the pollen is sticky or spiky to stick to insect's body. The petals are brightly colored to attract the insects, and they are scented. The stamen are inside the flower so that insect will brush past them and pick up the pollen. Here there is a sugary substance which is called a nectar. It is sweet. And then the stigma again is sticky so that when insect brush past, the pollen sticks to it. Coming to the bird-pollinated flowers. The flower is in a trumpet-shaped. Flowers do not have scents. There is no landing place for a bird, as you can see. The flowers are red, pink, and orange in color. So I have come to the end of our presentation. Good luck and stay blessed.